This is a presentation on the history of the 20th century struggle by members of the Liberal Party in Britain to bring about a peaceful solution to the age-old land question that created a nation of haves and have-nots. At the center of this struggle during the first decades of the century was none other than Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill returned to Britain from Egypt in 1898, resigned his commission in the army, and almost immediately entered into politics as a member of the Conservative Party. His first campaign was in Oldham, a constituency in the industrial region of Lancashire. He unexpectedly opposed his party's position on a tithes bill, after which the prominent Conservative Arthur Balfour said of him, "I thought he was a young man of promise, but it appears he is only a young man of promises." Winston's opponent won by more than 1,000 votes, but he was neither dismayed nor deterred. By late 1899, he was on a ship destined for South Africa, where he would report on the Boer War as a special correspondent of the Morning Post. He was not yet 25 years old. At the front, Churchill was caught in a fierce firefight and forced to surrender after losing his own weapon. He was then imprisoned at Pretoria, and after 3 weeks he began to plan his escape. One night in December, he made his way over the prison wall and boldly walked into Pretoria, and found his way to the railway line, where he boarded a moving freight train. Hiding by day, walking at night, he came by pure chance to the home of an Englishman who fed him and hid him in a mine. The Boers offered a £25 reward for his capture. He was described as follows: Englishman, 25 years old, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, indifferent build, walks with a forward stoop, pale appearance, red-brownish hair, small and hardly noticeable mustache, talks through his nose, and cannot pronounce the letter S properly. Churchill was hidden between bales of wool on a freight train. Some 16 hours later, the train crossed the frontier into Portuguese territory, and he was free. He was now famous and managed to secure a commission in the army, serving well in several engagements, including the release of his former fellow prisoners of war. Late in the summer of 1900, Churchill returned home to England. A general election was underway, and Churchill entered the campaign. No fewer than 11 constituencies sought him out to be their candidate. This time, Oldham elected him to Parliament. On the Boer War, he declared, "I was nearly a peace-at-any-price man up to the time of the declaration of the war. After that, I was a victory-at-any-price man." Conservative leader Joseph Chamberlain came to Oldham to support Churchill in the campaign. Chamberlain said of young Winston, "I think that Lord Randolph's son has inherited some of the great qualities of his father, his originality and his courage." Churchill was elected, but only by the slim margin of 222 votes. Yet he was exuberant, as were the leaders of the Conservative Party. Before taking his seat in Parliament, Winston started a lecture tour throughout Britain, then traveled to the United States and to Canada. Once in the House of Commons, he awaited his opportunity to speak. He rose and expressed his views on what ought to come out of the Boer War. "From what I saw of the war in South Africa, and I saw something of it, I believe that as compared with other wars, especially those in which a civil population took part, it has been on the whole conducted with unusual humanity and generosity. The immediate policy of the government should be to make it easy and honorable for the Boers to surrender and painful and perilous for them to continue in the field. He then commented on the role his father played over his long parliamentary service. I cannot sit down without saying how grateful I am for the kindness and patience with which the House has heard me. It has been extended to me, I well know, not on my own account, but because of a splendid memory which many old members still preserve. Winston's speech was, in a sense, his declaration of independence from any strict adherence to the party line. He urged sending more troops to South Africa to bring the Boer War to an end. Then he supported measures to reform the army and reduce expenditures on the military. Winston's own experiences, even as a young man, taught him valuable lessons regarding the defense of empire and the risks of modern war. The enormous and varied frontiers of the empire and our many points of contact with barbarous peoples will surely in the future, as in the past, draw us into frequent little wars. But we must not expect to meet the great civilized powers in this easy fashion. He added, "A European war cannot be anything but a cruel, heart-rending struggle which, if we are ever to enjoy the bitter fruits of victory, must demand, perhaps for several years, the whole manhood of the nation, the entire suspension of peaceful industries, and the concentrating to one end of every vital energy in the community." To defend the one empire about which he was concerned, that of the British people, Winston declared the absolute necessity of a strong modern navy. This was the subject of his second speech. Without a supreme navy, whatever military arrangements we may make, whether for foreign expeditions or home defense, must be utterly vain and futile. With such a navy, we may hold any antagonist at arm's length and feed ourselves in the meantime until, if we find it necessary, we can turn every city in the country into an arsenal and the whole male population into an army. Churchill became increasingly at odds with the entrenched leadership of his party. His crisis of conscience came in 1903, when Joseph Chamberlain began to push for the abandonment of Britain's free trade policies in favor of imperial preference. As Churchill biographer Lewis Broad states, "As the liberals coalesced to fight for a cause on which all liberals were agreed, the Conservative Party disintegrated." Churchill understood well the significance of the Conservative Party's abandonment of long-standing free trade policies. He declared, "This move means a change not only in historic English parties, but in conditions of our public life. The old Conservative Party, with its religious convictions and constitutional principles, will disappear, and a new party will arise, rigid, materialistic, and secular, whose opinions will turn on tariffs and who will cause the lobbies to be crowded with the touts of protected industries." Winston followed Joseph Chamberlain around the country, countering his every pro-imperial preference speech with the defense of free trade. Conservative free traders resigned from the government ministries. Winston broke with the party, but retained his seat in Parliament, crossing over to the opposition. In 1905, he was brought into the new Liberal ministry as Parliamentary Secretary for the Colonies. He was aged 31. Historian Roy Douglas wrote a detailed history of the struggles in Britain to solve the land question. He notes that during the general election of 1906, the proponent of Henry George's solution to the land question readily joined forces with liberals embracing free trade. Douglas writes, "The overwhelming majority of keen land reformers supported the Liberal Party, and most of those land reformers who were not liberals were included among a body which was soon to be reconstituted as the Labour Party." Britain now had a new Prime Minister, Henry Campbell Bannerman. He set down the land reform objectives of his government in a speech delivered on the 21st of December, 1905. "We wish to make the land less of a pleasure ground for the rich and more of a treasure house for the nation." The issue of land reform also applied to Ireland, where the Irish sought an end to absentee landlordism and an ultimate independence from the United Kingdom. Illness brought the resignation of Henry Campbell Bannerman in 1908, and he was succeeded by Chancellor of the Exchequer, Herbert Asquith. Churchill joined the cabinet as president of the Board of Trade. However, Churchill was required to stand for election, and he was narrowly defeated. So in typical British fashion, Churchill was invited to stand for election in Dundee, Scotland, where he emerged with a solid victory. David Lloyd George was now the new Chancellor of the Exchequer. Winston was now hopeful of great change in Britain. As Lewis Broad explains, "It was under the inspiration of Lloyd George that Churchill turned social reformer." Britain's proponents of Henry George's proposals for the public collection of the rent of land came together in 1907 as the United Committee for the Taxation of Land Values. They embarked on a public education campaign involving the circulation of over 50 million leaflets over 4 years beginning that first year. Some 250 members of Parliament signed a petition urging that the taxation of land values be adopted in the next budget. David Lloyd George knew this measure would never get past the House of Lords. It would be impossible to secure the passage of a separate valuation bill owing to the opposition of the Lords, and therefore the only possible chance which the government have of redeeming their pledges is by incorporating proposals involving land valuation in a finance bill. What David Lloyd George went on to propose was two forms of land taxation. First, an annual tax of 0.4% on the market value of land. Second was a 20% tax on any increase in the price of land when sold. Winston stood beside him and the other liberals on the land question, writing that land taxation was the most important and certainly the most fundamental part of constructive liberal social policy. However, so long as the Lords held the power of veto over measures passed by the House of Commons, reform measures, and those that attacked the monopolization of Britain's land had little chance of adoption. David Lloyd George decided on a strategy that would make it impossible for conservatives to accept his proposed budget. He convinced the king to agree to create a large enough number of new peerages to be given to liberals to enable them to outvote conservatives. As a result, a bill passed through Parliament and the Lords were finally deprived of their veto power. Now the contest returned to the House of Commons and a strategy developed by the Conservatives as expressed by Austen Chamberlain. It is certain that if we do nothing, the Radical Party will sooner or later establish their national land tax, and once established in that form, any radical chancellor in need of money will find it an easy task to give a turn of the screw. On the other hand, if this source of revenue is once given to municipalities, the Treasury will never be able to put its finger on the pie again. When Arthur Balfour attempted in the House of Commons on the 4th of May 1909 to defend the existing system by which the government raised its revenue, Winston rose in response. The immemorial custom of nearly every modern state, the mature conclusions of many of the greatest thinkers, have placed the tenure, transfer, and obligations of land in a wholly different category from other classes of property. The mere obvious physical distinction between land, which is a vital necessity of every human being and which at the same time is strictly limited in extent, and other property, is in itself sufficient to justify a clear differentiation in its treatment, and in the view taken by the state of the conditions which should govern the tenure of land from that which should regulate traffic in other forms of property. He followed this up with a speech during July in Edinburgh, Scotland. It is quite true that land monopoly is not the only monopoly which exists, but it is by far the greatest of monopolies. It is a perpetual monopoly, and it is the mother of all other forms of monopoly. It is quite true that unearned increments in land are not the only form of unearned or undeserved profit which individuals are able to secure, but it is the principal form of unearned increment which is derived from processes which are not merely not beneficial, but which are positively detrimental to the general public. Land, which is a necessity of human existence, which is the original source of all wealth, which is strictly limited in extent, which is fixed in geographical position, land, I say, differs from all other forms of property in these primary and fundamental conditions. Under the 1909 budget bill, the key to making the taxation of land values meaningful was a nationwide land valuation. Yet nothing much happened. And in mid-1911, nearly 200 MPs signed a petition demanding that the government proceed. David Lloyd George essentially ignored their demands, fearful the Liberals might lose power in the next election. A comprehensive land bill finally emerged in 1909, which mandated the compulsory sale of rural land to tenant farmers and compensation for improvements made on leased land. However, absent under the budget of Lloyd George's new government was a bill calling for the taxation of land values. Josiah Wedgwood, an ardent land taxer in the House of Commons, openly expressed his dismay. The valuation could be completed in a year if the government were in earnest. There are many in the Liberal Party who have had about enough of this. Liberal land taxers campaigned vigorously, explaining their vision of land reform. The Liberals found themselves now competing with candidates from the Labour Party in many constituencies, opening the door for Conservatives to capture enough votes to take these seats. Fearful of losing the votes of moderates, David Lloyd George actually repudiated assertions that he was a single taxer. Many Liberals felt betrayed. David Lloyd George took all this criticism in, and in February of 1914 made this announcement. The government has already accepted the principle of the rating of site values and intend to give effect to it by legislation. Some desire the whole burden to be transferred from the structure to the site. He stated he felt this proposition was impractical. The government's Land Inquiry Committee came out against the imposition of a national land value tax and instead recommended granting to local authorities the option of developing pilot schemes for either land nationalization or land value taxation. The 1914 budget included funding for the valuation of land and improvements separately for local purposes. Historian Roy Douglas describes what happened next. Then, with dramatic suddenness, came the most unnecessary and disastrous war in the history of man. Douglas adds, the land campaign, along with all other questions which were likely to evoke public controversy, was thrust aside as expeditiously as possible in the interest of national unity. One leading land taxer, C.P. Trevelyan, resigned from the government in protest against Britain's entrance into war. Josiah Wedgwood entered military service. Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty. After the disaster at Gallipoli, Winston resigned as First Lord and went on to fight with the army in France, returning to Britain and the House of Commons in the autumn of 1916. As the war came to an end, the nation's leaders and some major land-owning lords began to give thought to needed reforms. One, William Legge, the Earl of Dartmouth, wrote to Josiah Wedgwood that meaningful changes would require sacrifices of some kind from us all. But as it is inconceivable that after all that has passed we should go back to the old extremes of wealth and poverty, the old suspicion and prejudice, the continued warfare between class and class, employer and employed, it means especially that those who have most will have to make the largest sacrifices. A general election occurred shortly after the war. Labor withdrew its support for the coalition government. As a result, the Conservatives won a huge victory and returned with a clear majority in the House of Commons. As Roy Douglas observes, the results were an unqualified disaster to the land taxers, not only because most of the government supporters were hostile to their cause, but also because no alternative administration could be discerned on the opposition side of the House. Josiah Wedgwood ran as an independent radical and was returned. Some land taxers were re-elected, others rejected by voters. Liberals were driven apart based on who supported or who opposed the coalition government. A growing number of land taxers were drawn to the Labor Party. This association proved to be difficult, and many, led by R.L. Othwaite and J.W. Graham Peace, broke away to form the Commonwealth Land Party in 1919. Their outreach organ was a newspaper called the Commonwealth. What emerged from the government was a bill to expedite the public purchase of land, in part to provide small farmsteads and housing for war veterans. An immediate technical and political problem arose: how to establish the value of land for acquisition, or for that matter, taxation purposes. Remarkably, David Lloyd George remained silent as conservative leader Austin Chamberlain called for the abolition of existing land value duties and the entire process of land valuation. Herbert Asquith returned to the House of Commons in 1920, challenged David Lloyd George and his government to recommit to resolving the ancient land question. I still believe in the necessity, first of all, of the valuation, and next, as a consequence of that valuation, the taxing for public purposes, both imperial and local, of the site value of land, and that it should be taxed and rated at the same price at which the owner is willing to sell it to the community when the community wants to purchase it. The conservative government formed in 1923 was headed by Stanley Baldwin, who embraced new policies of protectionism and imperial preference. Baldwin called for an election to obtain public support for his policies. The Liberals united in opposition. Winston entered the campaign in West Leicester against a socialist and pacifist candidate. In a speech delivered on the 16th of November, 1923, Winston took Stanley Baldwin to task. I am forced to ask, when did Mr. Baldwin reach this extraordinary conclusion that the free import of foreign goods into the home market is the cause of existing unemployment? We have evidently witnessed a sudden mystic process of almost miraculous conversion. Again, Churchill was challenging the conservative leadership on the basis of long-standing principles in support of free trade. The conservative leadership ignored Churchill and the Liberals, instead trying to convince the British public that voting for Labour would usher in socialism and destroy the nation. The campaign was rough on Winston, with constant disruptions by socialists, and when the votes came in, Winston was rejected. The Liberals made something of a comeback at the expense of the Conservatives, but Labour again held the second highest number of seats in Parliament. Winston, who had been ill throughout the campaign, summed up his situation, stating that he was without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix.